introducing DAX, and then we're going to have Fraser, Neiman, Charles Cobb, and Gifford and Khadene Harris. We're going to be following up with sort of discussions about their engagement with DAX. And they win the day because they're handing out chocolate right now.
This is courtesy of Dean.
Courtesy of Dean. All right, Dean wins the day because they're handing out chocolate to Dean. Thanks, Dean. Take it away.
All right, good afternoon. So the next 4 talks are of a piece. We're all associated with the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, and so we're going to ask that everyone hold their questions till the end. So we'll do our presentations, and then you can ask questions of us. I'm Jillian Galle. I am the project director for DAX. Following me will be Fraser Neiman, who's the director of archaeology at Monticello, and then you're going to hear from Charlie Cobb and Gifford of the Florida Museum of Natural History, and finally Khadene Harris, who is a postdoc with DAX and is now, as of last week, an assistant professor at Kenyon starting in September. My role is to give you a quick overview of the archive, our history, our goals, and what we do. Fraser's going to talk about the technology, the database, and the website component of the project. Charlie and Gifford will talk about their spin-off from DAX, and then we'll hear Khadine's experience about using it as a graduate student. All right, so DAX was founded in 2000. It's the longest-running digital archive related to archaeology. We are a research archive, so we have topical and regional foci, and that really shapes the data that we collect and the data we deliver. And Fraser's going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And what we do deliver are detailed and standardized data on complete archaeological assemblages from sites of slavery in the United States and the Caribbean. So that includes artifacts, images of artifacts, field records, spatial data, maps. The project, when we started in 2000 and continuing through our work today, is truly built on collaboration. We developed the database, the website, and the metadata in close collaboration with over 50 archaeologists and historians who work on issues of slavery across the US and the Caribbean. Currently, the technology that powers our system is a PostgreSQL database, a Ruby's on Rails front end, and PHP query delivery system. You'll hear more from Fraser about that in a moment. And our audiences are broad. Primarily, it's a scholarly audience, though all the data we deliver is publicly accessible via the DAX website. Archaeologists, historians, material culture studies, and students all use the archive both to use the data for their own research and also to put data into the system. Just a little bit about how we've built this system over the last 18 years. We have done it primarily with grant funding. That we're based at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, also known as Monticello, and they provide bricks and mortar support, but our primary funding has come from the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Save America's Treasures, a little bit of funding from the National Science Foundation. That supports 3 full-time staff members, about 3 part-time staff members, and we have an endowment that was built with an NEH Challenge grant that keeps us going in between the major grant projects that we write. Our long-term goals are to provide material culture database and analytical training, as well as expansion of the data that we provide in the site, on the website. So when we were founded, we had 2 main goals, and we still have those same 2 goals. They're to facilitate the comparative archaeological study of regional variation in slavery and the archaeological record by providing standardized data, that's really critical, from multiple archaeological sites of slavery. And then also to create usable standards that could be used by any historical archaeology working on sites that date from the early modern Atlantic period. So why do we do this? Just very quickly. As probably many of you are aware, since the late 1960s, hundreds of sites of slavery have been excavated across the Caribbean and US South. These are just some early photographs of some classic sites of excavation: Monticello, Caribou Plantation in South Carolina, Montpelier estate in Jamaica, as well as sites like this are also excavated using a whole host of different methodologies, from stripping off plow zone and just digging the features to excavating and screening 100% of the soil to digging shovel test pits. That's my colleague in Jamaica in a deep shovel test pit. The artifacts get washed, they get cleaned, you might get an article, you might get a book out of them, that's it, and then they go into storage, and we hope the storage looks like this on the right. Often we go into collections and it looks like that. And so, you know, what does that mean? That means that the data, the raw data behind maybe the 1 or 2 articles or the book, is ultimately inaccessible to researchers, graduate students, anyone who wants to work with that information. And often they find the data are incommensurate if they want to do comparative research across sites and among regions. So these are just a host of questions, and I'm not going to run through them because I only have 6 minutes left. But there are a host of questions that you know, we bring to our research with DAACS, but that you know, scholars can bring any of these questions to the data that we have collected. So to facilitate research, so that we offer scholars and the public free and easy access to all the data we generate. They're delivered by our website, which you're going to hear about in a second. And as I said earlier, it's done collaboratively, so we have buy-in from the larger archaeological community. Quick screenshot our website. We started in 2000. It took us 4 years to develop the database, collect the initial set of data, launch the website in 2004. And when we launched, we had 10 sites and 600,000 records from the Chesapeake. We were originally called the Digital Archaeological Archive of Chesapeake Slavery, and that's what our network looked like, sort of our collaborative network looked like in 2004. And then in 2019, we're up to 85 sites and growing with over 4 million records. And our collaborative network looks like this. And in fact, we heard earlier from Stagville. Stagville is, we work very closely with Anna Egby-Davies on the Stagville collections, which are in the site. And so, how has this grown? Well, prior to 2014, the main options for collaborating with the archive were for people to send their collections to us at Monticello. And in fact, there's Charlie Cobb in an earlier iteration at the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology when he directed that institution there. So we would bring the collections to Monticello and physically recatalog all of the sherds, all of the artifacts to our standards, to our data standards, which you'll hear about. And not only artifacts, but the field records. We get boxes of field records, and then we parse the data, digitize the maps to ensure that the data were standardized. Or we would travel to collections. So we spend a good deal of time working in the Caribbean, and we go to Jamaica, Nevis, St. Kitts, and actually do cataloging on site with collections there. And this model still works. We still work with this model. We currently have an NEH grant to digitize, 2.5-year grant to digitize sites from the Flower Do 100 collection. We're working with Syracuse, Northwestern, Stratford Hall, all sending collections to us to analyze. But the second way people now, since 2014, thanks to a major grant from the Mellon Foundation, was the development of what we call the DAX Research Consortium, which was to develop a front end, a web-accessible front end to certified users, so people could enter their data directly into our database. And as a result, we now train archaeologists at Monticello on our cataloging protocols and on our standards. Again, they can go off to their home institutions, they can go to their field sites and catalog their data directly into the database. After their sites are completely in, the data have been vetted, we then launch that data out live. And just some pictures of what training at Monticello looks like over the years, where everyone learns how to measure color on ceramic sherds the right way and how to measure their bore diameters for their tobacco pipes. This new DAX Research Consortium has led to broader collaborations. You're going to hear from Charlie and Gifford about their work with DAX and how it has become for them a project called the Comparative Missions Archaeology Portal. So lessons that we've been learning over the last 18 years, and we're still learning, is that to develop and grow an archive of this size requires flexibility and changes to infrastructure and workflow. We definitely have to keep true to our mission so that the data, we are preventing data drift and that we can keep our data comparable and standardized across the board. we work hard to build a network of users and also our community of scholars to help us make sure that we're presenting the data that people need and want to use. And then also, I think all of you know that you have to be prepared for the long haul. It takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of time to build an archive of this size. And then a quick note also, which you probably all know, but I think it's worth setting out there for expectations for digital projects like this. It takes time. It's like all research takes time. Between 2004 and 2010, there were 2 undergraduate theses and 1 dissertation produced. That was my dissertation, and that was produced because I was working on the project. But after 2011, since 2011, we've had, as you can see, 7 MA theses, 9 PhDs, many in progress, and 32 in growing peer-reviewed publications. So it really, for us, I think, took 10 years, 6 years, 10 years of having that data and out there and available for scholars to really begin to engage on it in the level that we wanted them to when we developed the system. So I'm done. With 1 minute left to spare, I'm going to pass it on to Fraser. I walked away with the microphone. Here, I'll set up your PowerPoint for you.
Thank you, Jillian.
Hold on, I gotta put the microphone.
Oh, okay, great. It's been a long day. This reminds me a little bit of attending a full performances of, the ring cycle or something. So here we are in the last bit for today. I guess this is go to Dameron. So, and pursuing that Wagnerian metaphor a little bit, you'll detect some leitmotifs from Jillian's talk, linking from Jillian's talk to mine. So maybe a good place to pick up is again to kind of re-emphasize the goals of the DAX project, and the goal is really to try to give archaeologists an opportunity to learn something important about history. Often we love archaeologists or artifact towns. They love to dig stuff up. They love to fondle objects. They love to allow others to fondle them or not fondle them, as the case may be. But we're really about trying to advance historical understanding of the cultural dynamics of early modern slave societies in a systematic way using archaeological evidence. The problem that sort of inspired getting DAX started back in around 2000 really was when I showed up at Monticello and found a situation that looked like this. Archaeologists love to dig. They are not so keen often about actually converting their artifacts into data in a systematic way. So we were faced with lots of just simply uncatalogued collections. One of the bad things about archaeology as a discipline is the incentives to individual scholars are often structured to reward excavation as sort of the cool discovery process, but not to reward analysis on the back end. I mean, this even extends to the fact that from NSF, for example, it's much easier to get money to dig stuff up. It's almost impossible to get money to study collections. It's easy to get field school students to pay you to allow them to dig on your site, but that funding model fails utterly if you're trying to actually create high-quality data and do data analysis. Secondly, when archaeologists do create data, they do it in remarkably unsophisticated ways often, and this was especially true sort of in the 80s and 90s. They use free text fields, they don't use authority terms, they have no explicit classification and measurement protocols, data structures, no clue what that word actually means. Even when there are different, so that obviously though, if you're cataloging artifacts, there are classification and measurement protocols, but they're covert, right? They're inexplicitly articulated. And what that means is that unless they're written down, a single individual over the course of a year or two is going to create totally incommensurate records. And we can see this in legacy records from Monticello, from early digital work done in the late 1980s. So what are some solutions? Well, I think it's useful to think about 2 kinds of solutions, and the first is the ex post solution. And that is to say you try to put together legacy data as it comes from individual researchers, researchers bang them up together and come up with what we might call a least common denominator classification that would allow you to do quantitative analysis and do assemblage comparisons. This is, today, this is what we might think of as the open refine approach. The issue that, at least when we tried this to do it with Chesapeake sites, is that by the time you get the least common denominator so low, and the resulting classifications that work are so coarse-grained that all the information is washed out by the time you get to the end of the process. The other approach is ex ante, and that's what we're trying to do. I don't claim it to be the only approach, but at least I think it's one exploring, and that is to develop explicitly documented measurement protocols, develop and write them down. I mean, explicitly. We've got big manuals on the website to document these things. Develop archaeological data structures, instantiate them in digital infrastructure, canvass stakeholders widely to make sure that we're catching as much data that people want as possible. Okay, so how do we actually do this? Well, as Jillian suggested, there have been a couple of iterations. Early on, we were sort of using cutting-edge 1990s technology, a sort of local client server system in which we put the data, and then because we were worried about processing speed and table joins, that we had to denormalize MySQL backend for the web server and point-click query interface written in PHP that generated SQL queries. The problem with this setup was, there were several problems with it. The one that really hastened our transition to what we might think of as DAX 2.0, and that is our current setup, is the problem with satellite labs. So there were several labs in the region that were interested in using our DAX backend, but because we were, in the cutting 1990s era, this had to be a locally installed database. So Jillian was in the unfortunate position of having to maintain multiple instances of SQL Server scattered around Chesapeake. And that just, it was a total pain. So we're currently sort of in this new configuration that allows people to just do data entry in a web browser. Here's the DAX website, as Jillian just showed you. I just want to show you a little bit about what's there. We sort of have a eye candy section called galleries that feature sort of cool artifact types or cool sites that are intended to draw people in and get them curious. The guts of the site really are in three sections. One, archaeological sites, where you can sort of click and find individual sites to explore in more detail. Each site has a home page with a little sketch map here for Utopia 2, early slave quarter right outside of Williamsburg, early 18th century slave quarter right outside of Williamsburg. There's all kinds of sort of individual sites have detailed write-ups. For example, this is about building O and its stratigraphy. Is it portrayed in what we call a Harris matrix, an acyclic directed graph for those geeks in the audience. And the guts of the database is this query. The guts of the website really is this query, the database section, which has got a series of menus that you can sort of point and click, and it generates SQL queries in the background that goes out and collects data. So this is just one quick example. Say I'm interested in all the clay tobacco pipes from these three Utopia sites whose occupation span from about 1700 to the Revolution, right outside of Williamsburg. The first step, we choose the artifact class. Second step, we choose the level of aggregation at which we want the data summarized. Third step, we click on which sites we want. We get a little query selection summary here that tells us what we've done, and then run the query, and boom, there's a download, extends out here about 20 fields that has all kinds of wonderful data about pipes. Why would you worry? Well, actually, I don't have time to go into this. 4 minutes left. Thank you. Ethan is such a smiling, friendly timekeeper.
You're wasting time.
Yes, I know. Anyway, we don't have time to go into detail here, but what this particular query allows us to do, for example, is see that the three structures on the site, three main structures, the original excavators interpreted them as contemporary, sort of in a courtyard style arrangement. Actually, the one down here is much earlier than the other two. And the other two are not both slave houses. One's an overseer's house and one's a slave house. And then finally, there are the classification and measurement protocols that allow this all to happen. So we have, Jillian mentioned the DAX Research Consortium very briefly. This has allowed us to try to use the PostgreSQL and Rails front end to allow other people to do data entry right into a web browser. Our first experiment with this was the DAX Research Consortium, where we enlisted faculty and students from 6 major PhD programs across the country and 4 sort of research labs. The partners agreed to do little pilot projects to make sure the technology we built worked. And we successfully, I think, executed this project, but it raised actually 2 really tough issues. One related to what we might call data production transparency, and the other one related to data analysis skills. So once we allow other folks to begin entering data into the database, how do we make sure it's right? This is a huge problem. And it leads to really awkward questions. In fact, I think if we're going to come up with credible answers, we have to have some kind of active quality assurance process. And what we've ended up doing is training people in our protocols, training people in early modern material culture, and then testing them to make sure that they know their stuff and can accurately execute the protocols. The results in this first trial were sobering because roughly a third of the folks did wonderfully in our assessment, a third did okay, sort of passable, but a third just couldn't generate accurate data. So this is a hugely, I think, underappreciated problem. And these are folks from the top PhD programs in the country. So I mean, this is a huge problem. It's not their fault. It's the fault of the institutions that they're intending. Well, I'm up. 1 minute, I'm going to blow past this. But if you're interested in a discussion of the difference between artifact data and documents, talk to me afterward. The second problem really is what we might call data analysis skills and transparency. I'm going to be a little bit sort of out there and state that archaeological data are inherently quantitative. These sites contain tens, hundreds of thousands of artifacts. If you're going to pretend that you're actually going to extract information from that amount of stuff, you've got to use numbers. You've got to crunch numbers. And the one thing, again, that we sort of discovered in this is that most graduate programs in archaeology around the country no longer teach quantitative methods. Those of you who are in who are in history departments, this may have a familiar ring to it, a sad and tragic familiar ring. But the question is, so we have data, we've got all kinds of cool data out there. The question is, people want to come and use it, but they don't have the skills to really maximize the analytical possibilities. So what are the next steps? Well, we're, thanks to NEH, or at least this is a matching grant that goes along with one of our recent NEH grants. We're going to try to be offering 2-day workshops to be delivered at universities around the country. If you're interested, talk to Jillian. She can fix you right up. In trying to help people understand how better to use our data and maybe introduce them in a general way to using tools like R to do data analysis. And then secondly, we're going to try to launch a 3-week intensive course in early modern Atlantic material culture and protocols at Monticello that would lead to DAX certification and help people begin to contribute data to the archive. So that's it. 13. All right. Thank you. Oops. That's not remarkable how
So I'm just going to yell if you could just mic him. I'm going to talk for about 4 minutes and pass it over to him.
Okay. We could try that. I like you.
So when you get mic'd up, first of all, I want to thank Gifford, Fisher, wherever you are, for bringing up the topic of Native Americans, which will be our topic today. And a couple of years ago, Galle pointed out that the histories of victimization of Africans versus Native Americans, at least in Eastern North America, have been treated as separate processes. And of course, we know it's much more nuanced than that. And I thank you for that preamble, which took away a lot of stuff that I needed to say. So I'm going to talk about the genesis of the Comparative Mission Archaeological Portal, our C-map, and then Gifford's going to talk more about the nuts and bolts of it. Where's the...
I think just use the arrow.
Okay. Okay, got it. Because I'm an anthropologist, I have to show this as a kinship chart. At the bottom. So Jillian Galle can be very convincing. 10 years ago, when I was at SKIA, the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, she called me and said, "You guys are sitting on some pivotally important low country plantation enslaved quarters. We need to write a grant and look at this stuff." So to make a long story short, with her leading the way, we wrote a grant to Save America's Treasures, got a grant to look at the Yawn and Caribou collections in slave quarters, which was my first hardcore introduction to DAX and which convinced me upon the system. So about 4 years ago, I landed at the Florida Museum of Natural History. And at the time I arrived at the Florida Museum of Natural History, they were embroiled in a major informatics effort and digitization effort to cross-cut all the disciplines, natural history, as well as archaeology. And the biology sorts were involved with Specify, which is a very powerful program, but it's not really suited to archaeological and historical research. And then some of the archaeologists had made some initial efforts with using Rediscovery, which is really a curation program. It's not really intended as a research kind of program in the sense that DAX was. So Gifford and I sat down, looked at what we had, realized we were sitting on very important Franciscan mission collections from La Florida, and then we approached Jillian and said, "We need to write another grant to NEH to start a pilot project with Franciscan mission projects," and then that was successfully funded about 3 years ago now. So we're now in the middle of that. So we're looking at 3 Timucua missions in the interior of La Florida that were occupied largely during the 1600s. And I should go back for a second and say these are tens of thousands of artifacts of both European origin and Native American origin, where we're taking both metric attributes as well as qualitative attributes on all the artifacts. So a very, very intensive process, as I'm sure you got the gist from the people preceding me. And we're not only looking at the artifacts, but we're looking at the context. I mean, if words are roughly equivalent to artifacts in the archaeological to historical transition, I guess contexts are roughly equivalent to manuscripts and archives and that kind of thing. This is where we're pulling the artifacts from, areas that we have block excavated, spatial contexts that have been defined by various researchers as church, aboriginal structures, the convento, the cemetery, and so on. So those are the contexts from which the artifacts are being drawn. And finally, just transition to Gifford, I'll point out that there are thematic links to this conference of the sort that Linford talked about earlier, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but Native Americans in La Florida at least were living under what could be kind of a variation of a debt peonage. Okay, they got minimal pay, but they had to, for this work that they were mandated to do on an annual basis, particularly in the capital of St. Augustine, but it was incredibly variable. If you go to South America, you have the Julian system, which was definitely more harsh. But interestingly and sadly, ironically, many of the thousands of Native Americans that were living on these Franciscan missions were ultimately captured by English militias or their Indian allies and ended up as slaves and sold on the auction blocks of Charleston and then spread into and then disseminated throughout the Caribbean world. So with that, I'll leave it to Gifford.
So I'm just going to real quickly go over what our website is going to look like. And you know, as we said, this is based off of the DAX database and their website. So you will see a lot of similarities. On our homepage, you'll have the up top history. We're just going to talk about the history of the project, how we hooked up with DAX, mission sites, the database itself, where you can view and query the data that we've been inputting for these 3 sites that we've started with, along with the resources, and then the section about the database, which is extremely critical because this is where all of the manuals, glossaries, description of the database structure, and how to interpret the queries is going to be located. And this goes back to what Jillian and Fraser were saying about standardizing data protocols and data entry. And of course, we also have the galleries to get not just research scientists, anthropologists, archaeologists, historians interested in what we're doing, but it's really attractive to the public. pictures of cool artifacts, pictures of cool context from excavations. And what we're also adding is historic maps and documents related to these sites. And what I'm going to touch on a little bit later is people's stories. So this is the sites, and as you can see, a carryover from DAX. It says plantations and sites. We do not have plantations, so that will be changed as we're updating and refining our database. And then you go to the site page. This one, Fox Pond or Mission San Francisco de Patano, which is on the northwest side of Gainesville. Basic information, location, occupation dates, who excavated it and when. And I would like to say that on this map, where you see the pins and then in the location, Alachua County, Florida, that's not very specific where this site is located. And that's because every one of these mission sites that we're working on has a cemetery associated with it. And we do not want to give out, nor are we allowed to by the state of Florida, to give out exact location data for these sites. And that will also be explained on the website, that it is general locality reference. The state of Florida would actually like us just to pick the center point of each county that the site is located in, or that sites are located in, and use that as a pin. But so we're working on that. You also have the background tab here is going to have a detailed background summary of all the excavations that have taken place. Before you begin, discusses differences in excavation protocols. For example, a lot of what we deal with at the Florida Museum of Natural History are legacy collections excavated in the 50s and 60s, as well as current research that's been more recent in the last decade or so. So a lot of these collections, some of it was excavated using feet and inches, whereas now we use the metric system. We'll also talk about features, and we'll have field maps and images tabbed here once we add them, as well as bibliography for each site. Resources, again, galleries, presented papers, theses and dissertations, and bibliographies will also be, and these will be for all the sites in general. And starting to run out of time. So as Charlie alluded to, why did we use the DAX database? Why did we hook up with DAX? It's because it's such an extremely robust relational database with a set of standard protocols, and that helps to make all the data entered be able to be looked at the same way. You don't have, hopefully, data drift, the same type of artifact being entered differently, or different attributes being recorded by different lab techs. However, we did have to make some modifications. We're dealing with a different class of artifacts and a different group of people than DAX has been before. We have different material culture, different terminologies. And so this has seen the creation of new modules within the DAX database, specifically a lithic or stone tool module. And we've also developed some new queries or live data sets, which I'll mention again later when I summarize. So that's how we've used the database and to get started in this initial pilot program, testing to see if it will work on these 3 sites. And we think it does, but we need more testing. So where do we go from here? Well, right now we're working with 3 mission sites, and we plan to expand this. We have 2 coastal sites in Florida that are already in our collections that we plan to add next, as well as other sites throughout the greater Spanish Florida. I already have an agreement with a colleague at Florida State University to either test this out or give us their artifacts to test. And we'll also work with University of West Florida, North Florida, Georgia, etc. And then ultimately we'd like to expand to Southwest, Central, and South America, and hopefully involve all the Spanish missions, and then even go beyond that and involve more recent missions like the Chickasaw, missions to the Chickasaw in the 19th century. So with this data entry, what are the critical parts of this? Maintaining standardization of data entry. Well, we've also realized that we need for our project, separate from DAX, building off their database, but doing separate, the development of some new protocols that might work better for us potentially new data tables or fields that we can use. And since my job at the museum is as a collection manager, really trying to beef up the collection management component so I don't have to use rediscovery. It'd be great to have one database that can do it all. Now as we expand, we have to ask ourselves, how do we get others to buy into this large-scale project? Hopefully they'll find it interesting, and it'll allow for not just a local comparison just in Spanish Florida, but a larger, not just regional comparison of mission sites, but a comparison throughout the Americas, different regions, different time periods, different religious groups, Franciscans, Jesuits, etc. And then we have to ask, will they use this DAX database? And if not, how do we do data mapping for data aggregation? Obviously, you have to find easily mapped and agreed upon fields, but we have to maintain that data integrity and relational aspects, and any abbreviated aggregated data has to be linked back to a full database. So if we're working with Florida State University and they don't want to use this database, but we can map it into an abbreviated database, on the public consumption side, they've got to be able to link back to get the full record. Otherwise, it's not really that usable. And we want to make sure that on the public interface or website that the data is not only accessible, but also usable. You can get lots of data out there, but unless people can use it, digest it, and work with it the way that they want, are you doing much good? I'm almost done. We've developed what we call live data sets or canned queries, which basically would be like, I want to look at all of the Spanish pottery or European pottery and Native American pottery summarized by context, and you just click on it on the link, and that data is spit out, so you don't have to build your own queries. That's built on just talking with other archaeologists and historians, what kind of questions they would ask. And then finally, we also want to work with, make this interesting to non-research scientists. And one of the things that we found in past exhibits we've developed is involving people. Working with organizations like LaFlorida.org, bringing in people that we know were on these mission sites and telling their specific stories and linking that back to the archaeological data and the historical knowledge about those sites. So I will stop now.
Thank you. This is for your pocket or wherever you're comfortable, and then this goes on your lapel. Perfect. Oh, it's upside down. Dang. Thank you. Yeah. Do you want me to clip it for you?
Please do.
Okay.
Please. Thank you. Awesome. So, where am I? There we go. Thank you, everyone, for being here, staying. So, in my talk, I will be describing DAX from the perspective of a grad student collaborator. And from Jillian and Fraser, you might now have a better sense of the philosophy and the vision and a bit of the architecture and of the archive itself and the goals for collaborating with other scholars. So what I will do with my few minutes is describe how I've collaborated with DAX over the years and how I've utilized the archive in my dissertation research. So my hope for the talk is to provide some insight for folks here who are interested in creating opportunities for graduate research, what that might look like in terms of training, support, and creating a community of junior scholars who are, whose research is already in conversation. So the first half of my paper, I'll be talking about my history with DAX and how I began working with them and what I think were the successful strategies that they employed to encourage grad student engagement with the archive while maintaining high standards for the data within an open source context.
And the second half of my paper will look at my research and how simply working with the archive has shaped and continues to shape the questions I ask in this research. So I first started working with DAX as a master's student at the University of the West Indies in Kingston when the archive was still in its infancy and it had just begun its expansion outside of the Chesapeake. I started as an intern on their New River project in Nevis, where myself and 5 other UE students received training in field methods and material culture identification. And so when I went on to graduate research at Northwestern, I maintained that connection, and through their fellowship program that provides partial funding for, that's reserved for scholars interested in using DAX data in their research, I received additional training in the DAX protocols and the database application that I was able to use in my dissertation research. So I bring up the details of my trajectory to highlight the possibilities that working with DAX aims to foster and the potential of the archive beyond its commitment to sharing standardized archaeological data with researchers and the public at large. There is also a strong commitment to ensuring that the data within the archive can generate avenues for research. So as you've heard, DAX's general approach has been to include in the archive sites long excavated, like Seville and Montpellier, whose collections had been written off, but had been in storage and not necessarily accessible to the public. And they're also including new sites, which I'll get to as well. So to kind of summarize the workflow or the engagement with graduate student collaborators, I want to highlight the following practices. First, myself and other grad students who want to work with the archive already approached DAX with a project in hand. And we're interested in learning about new quantitative methods in archaeological data analysis that will allow us to take full advantage of the fine-grained comparisons that DAX data make possible. The other advantage is that it is open source and we do not pay to add our data to this growing archive. And it's my hope that it remains that way. And second, when cataloging at our home institutions, we typically work closely with the analysts in the DAX lab to ensure the quality of the data. And this means regular communication over email or phone and heavy use of the cataloging manuals that Fraser mentioned earlier. And I mentioned that so as to allow folks to kind of orient their expectations on how long or how detailed such a process is. The advantage of working with the archive for both research and teaching comes from the ability to move between scales, to make sense of the materials that we excavate and uncover, and how the patterns that we witness speak to broader historical contexts or appeal to certain theoretical frameworks. So instead of kind of talking around it, how working with DAX has framed my research, I'll illustrate it by describing briefly how I've worked with the archive and how it's been kind of generative. So in my research, I examined how land and labor arrangements impacted the economic decisions of formerly enslaved laborers on the island of Dominica. So this work was part of a multi-year field project that ended around 2016-2017 and was designed to examine 3 estates in Dominica from slavery through emancipation: Morne Patap, Bois Cotlet, and Sugarloaf. Now in this regard, I was especially fortunate to work on a project that examined both slavery and the years after emancipation in an effort to highlight the everyday practices that distinguish these time periods and other research goals. So because as many of you know and are likely wrestling with it in your own research, free people in former slave colonies met emancipation without widespread access to land, citizenship, education, stable wages, or labor rights. Both historical and archaeological data suggest that in some contexts, the material conditions of the formerly enslaved did not improve immediately or drastically. So what this opens up is a temptation to dichotomize the emancipation period into what Rebecca Scott calls either a transcendental liberation or a complete swindle. So what my research calls for is a way to look finely at free people's practices, compare those with both the pre-emancipation years and contemporaneous sites. Enter DAX. So in addition to support for cataloging, DAX staff produces a seriation-based chronology for each site using the same methods that Fraser has been instrumental in developing. And what this has allowed me to do is confidently compare sites to examine post-emancipation patterns in material culture. And to that end, I'm going to walk you through a really simple query that I completed when I was attempting to work out an argument for my dissertation. I did this for the Morne-Patat site, one of the 2 sites that I'm comparing for this research. And I wanted to know simply what ceramic wear types were found in the most recent occupation of the site. And I ran an MCD query, imaged up here, and that Fraser kind of highlighted before, which is essentially asking the database to return all the ceramic wear types for the most recent phase of the site and their count and their weight. Now, I could take this in a number of different directions and increase the complexity of the analysis. But most simply, I could just compare Morne-Patat's patterns with other plantations with similar occupation phases and trajectory, meaning when the estate was occupied after slavery ended in 1838 in the Caribbean. So this can tell me what formerly enslaved people were utilizing in everyday life. But it introduces questions about how formerly enslaved laborers are participating in global markets or consumer trends. So when I initially ran this query, it was really just to familiarize myself with the data and in a way that was not overwhelming. And those are options too, if you choose to work with it. So since then, and with the help of Fraser, Jillian, and the rest of the DAX staff, we've worked with the larger data set to determine more subtle patterns and using analyses like abundance indices and discard rates for particular artifact classes, which we won't talk about today. But I bring all this up to illustrate how working with the DAX database kind of helps researchers tack back and forth between material culture and the larger historical context in which these patterns gain their meaning. So I want to quickly close by suggesting that in these conversations that we'll have over these 2 days, concerning expanding digital research and how establishing communities, So I want to quickly close by suggesting that in these conversations that we'll have over these 2 days concerning expanding digital research and establishing communities to make standardization possible, that we consider how new research from junior scholars fit into these plans that we're forging. Because as I see it, there are tremendous opportunities for graduate training and broadening of skill sets, kind of alluding to what Fraser mentioned earlier about the decline of quantitative methods in archaeological training. So there is tremendous opportunity to broaden the skill sets of grad students that often only arise from these wonderful collaborations.
All right, we have plenty of time for questions for the entire panel. I'd like to open it up to questions. Let's go with Jane first, and then we'll go with that.
Thanks. That was a wonderful panel, and that's a great tool. We use it in classes all the time. So thank you so much. I was just going to get back to my Florida friends a minute. In the mission sites, I know at least in some of the places there will be Africans as well, and I wonder if you can already see any kinds of evidence for that, or are we going to have to prove it documentably?
Let me handle it. Thanks. Okay, so the question was that on the mission sites in Spanish Florida, that there would be Africans there, and can we see that? And no. Thank you.
Wait a minute.
Right now, in terms of the material culture, we have not seen any evidence of African presence in the 3 mission sites that we've been analyzing right now. We haven't done all of the historical background research on them to know if there's documented presence of Africans yet.
Well, one little quick thing maybe to look for. In Tallahassee, I was just there, and Jerry was showing me what they dug out at San Luis. And one of the things that's really become interesting in all these places is figas or igas, which we also have at the Hermitage, and that kind of thing. So that might be a sign of something.
Yes, in St. Augustine, in one of the Spanish mission sites in St. Augustine, it was excavated. It was at the Fountain of Youth Park site, so it's part of the Nombre de Dios mission. And these excavations took place in the 1950s, so the contextual data is not very good, but we do have one figa from that site which may have been associated with a burial But we don't know that yet, and we have to still work on that. From the other mission sites, we do not have any, we haven't gone to work on the Tallahassee mission site yet, but we would like to.
We had a question there, and then we'll go down there.
Hi, I'm Greg Malley, UC Santa Cruz. I have a question for the DAX team. I'm just curious, it's an amazing resource, and I use it also in teaching. I want to echo Jane's point, and that's actually where my question lies. I felt like there was a lot of discussion in your talks about training researchers to use the site and training people in the appropriate entry of data into the DAX format. And I wondered whether you considered at all creating any kind of tutorial for users of the site, something that without attending a multi-day workshop, but that might ramp people up because it's a challenge in part because it's so powerful, right? There's so much in there.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Greg. And actually, if you go to the DAX website and you go under research and you look under syllabi, you will see Greg O'Malley and Cameron Monroe's syllabus for their Atlantic slavery class they teach together jointly, and they use DAX in that. So, so first of all, actually, I want to play off of that a little bit. One thing that I did drop from my presentation due to time was how we have been working with professors and how professors are using DAX to teach as well. And so we do have a number of syllabi online that you can see how DAX is being used in a whole host of different types of courses. The new NEH grant that Fraser alluded to, we just recently received a Phase 3 Digital Humanities grant, and that is to not only do expansions and updates to the interface for data entry, but for the website and the public-facing site. So there actually will be coming soon in the next year or so, video tutorials on how to use the site, some brief write-ups, and we hope much more intuitive and easy search capabilities right on the homepage. So you can type in straight pin right from the very beginning and get an instant summary of how many straight pins or ficas or whatnot. So yeah, but stay tuned.
There's a question right there.
My question is whether or not, I thought I saw an icon for a church in West Florida. There was only one church there. So my question is, where is that? Where's that close to Contemporary?
That, so the map that we used had no churches there in West Florida at all. And because the University of West Florida has been working on a mission site there around Pensacola, I cut and pasted one of the churches and put it over there because that is one of the data sets we would like to get put into our CMAP database. So it's on the north side of Pensacola. But there was others. The mission trail went from St. Augustine all the way, ultimately really went all the way to Louisiana. And then you could, some argue, you could go all the way to Texas and California as well. But so that's where that one was.
Okay, that's good to hear because that leads to my second question. I'm from Pensacola. My family's from Pensacola. And the story that was told, and then I heard again from my own work in Cuba, was that, and then so my question to you is there any validity to this, based on what you know, that there was a certain amount of migration between Cuba and Florida using the barrier islands there at Pensacola, back and forth?
Not that I know of from Pensacola to Cuba, but when the Spanish ceded Florida to Britain, Great Britain in 1763, they left Florida.
Yeah.
Now, we do know that in the 18th century and 19th century, Cuban fisheries went up the west coast of the peninsula up to all the way to Tampa region, mostly south of there. But I don't know of any direct migrations from.
They weren't really migrations.
Or movements.
Residents.
Yeah. So no, I don't know. In my knowledge, I don't know if any of that.
We have a question right there.
I have a question for each of you. My question for Florida is, at any of the mission sites, could you tell me through the database how many children were enslaved and what affiliation, Native American affiliation, those children might have been a part of at each site?
Well, at the missions themselves, so we're not enslaved peoples the way that we talk about people being enslaved. The natives on the mission, they were not considered slaves. We don't know from the archaeological data, we can't tell, other than through the cemeteries. You can't get an estimate of, you know, the adults to children. But we do, the Spanish were very good at keeping records, and we do have a lot of records of baptisms, marriages, especially in St. Augustine, but we do have documents when Franciscans would travel through the Florida missions and document how many people were there at certain times. We can trace the how certain missions grew, collapsed. When populations got low on missions, especially in the 1650s after the Temuco Rebellion, certain missions were deserted and they were moved together, and so we know not only that, you know, people from villages right next, you know, sort of next to each other that were affiliated moved into one mission, but we also have records that people from different sort of ethnic or dialectic groups were moving into the same missions. And in fact, we also know from historical documents that certain areas, like the northernmost of the missions that we're working on right now, served as a population reservoir, and they weren't hit early on in the 1600s with epidemic diseases as other areas, and so they would move out. And there's interesting documents about how you had to get the agreement of the chief, the local chiefs, to move people out. And so there was some active agency amongst the Native Americans throughout this mission period, and especially in the 18th century with the collapse of the missions because of the raids of the British and their Native American allies. They all moved to St. Augustine or west, and you really see then the negotiation of their place in Spanish society.
Then my question for DAX is, I'm a museum professional, and I wanted to know how are museums or museum studies programs using DAX, and if you could tell me.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. So we collaborate extensively with many museums. So Drayton Hall, Mount Vernon, those two museums actually use the DAX database as their main cataloging system for their archaeological collections. And then also they are in turn, as is Monticello, using archaeological data to help structure exhibits. So you know, the Paradox of Liberty exhibit that actually is opening in Detroit next week, right? I think I'm looking at Fraser here. You know, contains, you know, a host of artifacts from Monticello that are in the DAX database, and certainly the narratives that come from the archaeological record. Those narratives would be very hard to generate without the data that we've accumulated and put into DAX to answer those historical questions. So I know that Mount Vernon also, they have actually a dedicated website called the Mount Vernon Midden. You can go check it out. The data, all the data they serve through that site is actually directly from DAX, and they have linked that to account records, store account records of what George Washington is purchasing, but it's also stuff that's being discarded not only by Washington but by his slaves. And so there are online exhibits as well. The International Slavery Museum at National Museums Liverpool, we did a collaborative project with them in 2008, excavating on Nevis and St. Kitts, and there's an extensive online exhibit, if you will, about slavery on Nevis and St. Kitts, all drawing on the work that we did, both excavation and the collections that resulted from those excavations that come up.
I think we've got time for one more question. All right, there we go.
Gibb, you mentioned about this connecting people in the end.
Yes.
Can you just elaborate more about how that would surface for people who might want to know? I mean, once you've got family and people have those things, when we hear that kind of thing, our ears perk up a little bit. So.
Yeah, we did, years ago, we did a virtual exhibit on St. Augustine, which is currently being updated because, I mean, this was the late 90s and it looks really dated, so it's being updated. And then, and what we found in that is that through historical documents, we know of, you know, the archaeological record is usually not, it's hard to tie artifacts to a particular person, but coupled with the historical documents, we know of specific people at specific sites. And we found that that's one of the areas of the virtual exhibit that people were really engaged with. And we hired an artist to do a drawing, a hypothetical drawing of the person, and just wrote up like a 1 or 2 paragraph story about the person. And then when we did our first colony exhibit in conjunction with the 450th anniversary of the founding of St. Augustine, we continued that trajectory of adding the stories of people, specific known people in the history of St. Augustine in Spanish Florida. And visitor surveys again found that that was one of the most impactful moments of the exhibit, where people got a sense of an individual and their role in the past. And that's something that we would like to continue with this database, is in working with historians. For example, like when we add the mission at Nombre de Dios in St. Augustine, we know the cacique, the chief of the village at the time that was founded. And a lot of people are surprised to hear that it was a woman. And so we tell her story, and the more people that we can get involved in the story and the narrative, the more interesting we feel it becomes to, to not just, yes, to researchers, but more importantly, to the general public. Yeah. And it shows the importance of what we're doing. Yeah. And I'd also, on a side note, I'd also like to say, one of the sites that we hope to add that's in our collections, the mission at San Juan del Puerto, is on Fort George Island, and just on the north, and it encompassed the whole part of the island, and that's where Kingsley Plantation is, that has standing slave houses.
Okay, so everyone join me in thanking the panel. All right, that's it, folks. We made it to the end of day 1. I'd like to thank everybody for their engaged conversations, their wonderful questions, their great presentations. And remember, we got basically a whole day ahead of us tomorrow of these